series editor for the Best American Comics series from Houghton Mifflin. I'm also the programming director for the MoCA Comics Festival, and I'm the publisher of Read This Books, a very small avant-garde comics imprint. And I've also had the great opportunity to teach classes about comics for several years, and as I was telling some of our panelists earlier, there was no student who took my graphic novels class who didn't have to read, study, discuss, and write about City of Glass. Because for a number of reasons, I think a lot of which are self-evident to anyone who has read the book, which probably many of you have, and maybe some of which we'll at least touch on today. It's a book that really exemplifies a lot of the things that comics can uniquely do expressively, but in a way that proceeds directly from the content as opposed to being simply an exercise or experiment. And the content that it proceeds from, of course, is a novel by Paul Auster, which is also wonderful for teaching purposes because students can compare the graphic novel to the original prose and really see all of the choices that go into making a comic. That comics don't exist in a state of nature. They're the product of a lot of intelligent choices. And City of Glass, more than most graphic novels that have been published over the last dozen years or so, is a book that makes all the right choices. Since we're already running late, we have four panelists who probably need no introduction. Please join me in welcoming Paul Auster, Paul Karasik, David Mazzucchelli, and Art Spiegelman to the stage. I actually wanted to start today's panel with an epigraph from Paul's work. And this is a quote from the Book of Memory in The Invention of Solitude. And in it, you're talking about translation, which you did a lot of as a younger writer.
Yes.
And you write about a translated edition. It is both the same book and not the same book, and the strangeness of the activity has never failed to impress him. And that seemed to me a kind of apt quotation when thinking about the graphic novel adaptation of City of Glass and the original prose version.
Well, this is not a translation, it's an adaptation. There's a difference. And I suppose we are all very familiar with this thing called adaptation because of films. So many books that we've read have been turned into movies. And as we know, most of these adaptations don't work. This is the rare book, a good book that becomes a good film. So in this case, I should back up maybe just a little and say that Art and I have been friends for a long time. And at some point, 25 years ago or so, he started talking to me about doing a graphic novel. So why don't you do it? And he wanted to start a series of getting novelists to do this. Well, to tell you the truth, I could never get too excited about that idea. I thought about it, but I didn't really feel the necessity of doing it. And then some more time went by, and then Art said, well, I have a new idea, adapting novels that have already been done.
I gave up on the first idea. The first idea was the phrase graphic novel, which was irritating me, was coming along, and Mouse was out there doing well, and I figured the company that's beginning to like crowd onto that shelf was mainly Dungeons and Dragons manuals, and I figured we needed to jumpstart this. If it was going to work as a section of a bookstore separate from the Garfield collections, it needs to be more graphic novels. Okay, I give up. If they're novels, let's get William Kennedy and Paul Auster, people interested in doing such things. And the problem was, it's a rather rarefied language, learning how to really make a comic that's worth making. one problem. And second, if you're going to learn a rarefied language as a novelist, it might as well be screenwriting, because there's a much bigger money pot at the end of it. There's more glamour connected to it until very recently. And the result was, everybody sort of was interested until they started looking at what it would involve, you know? And then it was like, whoa! And for Paul...
I never even got that far.
You were a good hypocrite. You were a very good hypocrite. You said, oh, that's interesting. Plus, I kind of put you together with an artist who loves your work, who's here today, Lorenzo Metodi.
Yeah.
You liked him, you liked his work.
He's a great artist, and he's a wonderful man.
And it seemed like that could be cool.
Yes,
yeah, and Lorenzo's right here. And then the problem became doing it. So one time, I'm taking a walk with Paul in Prospect Park, and says, I've been thinking about your book. All right, what's up? And he said, well, I see a little boy hovering above the water. Huh. Oh, sounds great, Paul. Get right on it, you know? So then I don't hear about it for about a year and a half again. And then he says, so I have a new book coming out. Would you like to do the dust jacket? And it's Mr. Vertigo.
Mr. Vertigo.
Which has as a central image
the boy who levitates. Yeah.
So, yes, as soon as the idea really ignited, it went back to your language.
It became words rather than pictures and words.
And then I should say that this started as that idea, and then when I gave up, a then friend of mine, it's probably... Oh, okay.
If I can pause you for a second, Art?
Yes, sorry.
No, that's okay.
As much as you want from the book, don't add any words that are not in the book. And they did that. And so even though the language is, of course, is very stripped down for this, there's nothing that didn't come from the original. And so I felt satisfied with that solution. And then they went and ran with it. And I really feel the results are brilliant. So let's hear what they have to say now.
Well, I wanted to back up a little bit, if we could, because I was sort of thinking of both Paul and Art about your kind of career trajectories and life trajectories, kind of leading up to the point of collaboration a little bit, and it seemed like there was something similar about like the moment and context in which your work both first came to be widely known. If we can just show the next slide, just very briefly. I mean, one of the things that I learned recently during the occupation of Wall Street, Paul, was that you were involved with the student protests at Columbia.
Yeah, I was arrested and thrown into jail, and part of the big revolution there in 1968.
Yeah, and you appear in a documentary called The Fall that's about that, and I learned that because a friend of mine was screening that as part of the Occupy activities that were happening.
Is that the documentary in progress, or an older one?
Peter Whitehead's documentary?
No, I don't even know it. I've never seen it.
Oh, you appeared. Yeah.
It was the 60s, you know?
Yeah. And Art was also, involved in the more, I think, artistic and psychedelicized side of...
Meaning communes and LSD rather than the front lines of the barricades.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're only 1 year apart in age, so you kind of experience this in similar, if different ways.
Yeah. Well, we were talking before about how America has turned psychotic today. Well, I think that was another psychotic moment in American history. And we were so young and vulnerable at that. And I'm sure it had an enormous impact on everything.
I think it hasn't been not psychotic for 300 years.
Well, there are moments of great intensity, and that was one of them.
Does that participation in the revolutionary counterculture of that period still sort of inform your response to contemporary political events?
Without question. I should add, I was not a activist in the sense that most of my time was spent reading books and writing, but I had strong political convictions, and when the moment came to either do something or not do something, I chose to do something. But it's not as though I spent my 20s as an organizer or activist, but there it was. The moment came and I wanted to participate.
And Art, it seems sometimes when I look at that time that the underground comics artists had a lot of political sympathies, but kept the sort of political side of the counterculture sometimes more or less of an arm's length? It depends a lot artist to artist, obviously.
Totally artist to artist.
Yeah.
But I think everybody's ambient empathies were the same. It's kind of, you know, like I would go to all the protest marches and stuff in the hopes of meeting a nice hippie woman. And the Rat, I tried to work for the Rat, but it was right after they got taken over by feminists and they kicked off. They accepted a cover of mine and then didn't run it.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened. So the other was more sympathetic to a wider spectrum.
And if we can show the next slide, one of the things that's interesting to me too is that you'd written a lot as a younger writer. You did poetry and translations. You had an early book that was a memoir that I quoted from.
The Invention of Solitude. Yeah.
And I guess City of Glass was your first widely published fiction novel.
It was the first novel. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if my research is 100% right, but it looks like it came out first from a kind of small, kind of avant-garde press, and then had a mass market edition.
Because the book was written, see, it was published in '85, it was written in '81, '82, and then it was rejected by 17 or 18 publishers, which that dragged on for about a year and a half. And during which I wrote the second panel of the New York trilogy, and then as well into the third. By the time the small press, Sun and Moon Press, took it on, located in Los Angeles of all things. The New York trilogy published in LA, but so it goes. And he did have a very good list. It was, as you say, small, avant-garde publisher. And for some reason, the books took off. He got noticed, even though the first printing, I think, was 2,000 copies, the hardcover. And my advances for each of the 3 books was 0. So that was
a great tradition of small press
publishing. Big time launch there. But still, I'm very grateful to Douglas Mazzucchelli, the publisher, because otherwise I was going to drown.
Yeah. What's fascinating to me is looking at the covers of like the first small press edition and the mass market edition. It sort of indicates the extent to which it's like a really, if you can go back, sorry. Indicates the extent to which it's kind of a liminal book. It's the experimental publisher sort of presents the book as if it's a work of literary fiction. The mass market publisher really pushes like the film noir.
Yeah, woodblock covers were very popular in the mid-'80s for some reason.
Yeah.
So
that was a kind of weird like Miami Art Deco noir kind of motif of that time. And just the next slide really quickly. And it's interesting too to see how
that's the British Faber edition on the left.
Yeah.
That was the first time the 3 books were published together.
Yeah.
In one volume.
And I was also fascinated to learn, if we can show the next image, that the book actually won a prize for detective fiction, the Edward.
Well, it was nominated.
Oh, it was nominated?
Yeah. It was very strange, and because I never thought of it as a detective novel at all.
Yeah.
But suddenly I was nominated, and this same publisher took me, we all went to the awards, or the Edgar Awards, and I remember we went to the Algonquin Hotel after, and he said, I'm going to buy you some champagne, we'll celebrate. And the waiter came and he opened up the champagne and he poured it all over me. It was like a fire hose of champagne. My one jacket and my one tie.
Baptized.
And if we can show the next slide, what's interesting to me is that like City of Glass and the first volume of Mouse really came out fairly close to each other. And they were both these kind of liminal books that are blurring boundaries. And I think they got tagged with a lot of labels like postmodern or deconstructionist at the time. Was that something that you felt was being impressed upon your work?
Yes. First, the detective connection always puzzled me. I mean, obviously, I was using it, but trying to get somewhere else with it. And then, the idea that I was influenced by French theory and was actually getting all my ideas from Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida, it just wasn't true. And so there have been whole books written about this, many books, about my postmodernist credentials, and I haven't read these people. So, I've read a lot of philosophy and a lot of other things, but not those people.
In art, you had to deal with people writing things like, this is not a comic, or this is an example of postmodernism, or whatever. Did you feel like your work was being framed by a cultural moment in some way that wasn't appropriate to your intentions?
Well, my intentions were to find an audience that wasn't reading comics and make a long comic book that needed a bookmark and needed to be reread to do it. And then I think it's either that essay or one of the others that I'm looking at a slide that I'm not looking at. All right. No. Anyway, the article that appeared in the Times talked about it as an example of postmodernism. And I very frankly not only hadn't not read Lacan, I had never heard the phrase postmodern. So for me, it was like I was interested in modernism. So I was just doing it now, and I guess that means postmodernism.
I got labeled later as postmodern.
Wouldn't that be pre-futurism?
Futurism. And I just wanted to touch on a couple other points of commonality before we really get into City of Glass proper, if we can go 2 slides forward. The other thing is, though, even though City of Glass gets tagged as some kind of detective novel, you do have some, I think you both have, a real authentic connection to detective fiction. I think probably, even though Mouse and
The
City of
slides
Glass
aren't being changed if you care.
Oh.
I'm seeing what you've
Oh no, that's okay. That one's fine.
Sorry.
I think the work of arts that City of Glass actually reminds me of the most is Ace Bowl Midget Detective.
That's interesting.
Which is a kind of, I suppose, deconstructionist detective story among a lot of other things.
I would have used the word deconstructionist, but I would have agreed that it was a kind of riff on detective stories.
Yeah, is that something that you have shared in your friendship as a common interest? Have you discussed this a lot? Or
We've talked about film noir. I mean, we like these that period of American filmmaking, but I don't know. We don't have very serious discussions.
Talk about smoking.
It's smoking, and what are we going to have for dinner?
I'll just go back to the film part of this for one second, because there's something I wanted to interject earlier, which is when I first asked Paul about the adaptation of a book rather than making a new book, he said, yeah, you can do it, because I think City of Glass keeps getting optioned for movies over and over again, and nobody can figure out how to do it.
No one should write a script.
Yeah,
and that makes sense,
yeah,
as you'll see when David and Paul talk.
Yeah, anyway, if we could, I don't know, so can you jump ahead to a different numbered slide? Is that possible?
Just throw a number at me.
Oh, okay, terrific. Let's go to 23, because we are a little compressed for time given some of the technical stuff, and I really would like to get into the nuts and bolts of City of Glass.
The 2 different covers of the 2.
These are the 2 editions of City of Glass, the original one from 1994 and then the re-edition from 2004. David, you did the cover artwork for both. I think you
Designed it together.
Okay.
Well, I did the cover art for the first one. The second one, Paul and I designed together.
How does the cover suggest the different context for the book?
Dressing, and this was, I think this was supposed to announce, this series of books that were going to be coming out as adaptations of existing contemporary noir. So that dictated a lot about the way that version was supposed to look, and then it just went away for a long time.
Yeah. The book was kind of like legendary for a while because it sort of appeared and then went out of print. And
we actually, I think we ended up missing the initial release date they wanted, but we're told that's fine, we'll just move it to the next season, only to find out that when it was released as a back order. So the fact that it got 16,000 orders as a back order, I thought was not bad, but there was no follow-up. It was just...
And simultaneously, the editor who was handling the book,
the one who bought the series,
left pretty much the day that the book was released. I spoke once with the person who wrote the review in the New York Times. It miraculously appeared in the New York Times just a little blurb about it, and he said, yeah, I got this box from Avon, and there was some cookbooks in it, and there was some romance novels, and the bottom was this strange thing that I just dug out. There's nobody was promoting this book.
I didn't know any of this.
You're trying to protect your Paul.
And Art, how would you describe what the brief for Neon Lit was at the time that it was launched as a kind of imprint?
Okay, I didn't want to do it. That's right. I just didn't want to do it. I don't believe in adaptations very much, although there have been a few good ones. And this was a devolution of that original idea of something else I don't believe in, which is collaboration, which I do more and more of. But I thought that the best graphic novels, comics, are made by single units. And the idea of marrying novelist, illustrator, cartoon artists of one kind or another seemed like possible, but I'd become allergic to it growing up with ink to buy, colored by, penciled by, credits in comic books. And so I was wary of that as a process. Bob Callahan, who was desperate for money at all times, said, "We'll do the adaptations." I said, I don't want to do adaptations. And they said, "You got to do it. I can't pay my rent." Which I finally caved and allowed it to happen. And he continued to be unable to pay his rent, so that every foreign edition that came out, the artist never saw a penny of, because the money filtered through him and disappeared into his rent for years. In doing this thing, we were talking about various possible writers that could work. The only one I agreed with originally was Paul. A, because I know how to talk with Paul without feeling self-conscious about letting the various reservations come out as well as my interests, although I didn't know how disinterested Paul was till today. I went back to talking about dinner. Then it got launched because this guy, Bob McCoy, there loved the idea, really wanted to do it. And I found this interesting mainly because it couldn't be done. The thing that I was just talking about with the film adaptations that didn't work, this is one of the least visual books I've ever been able to read, in that it's not where it lives in its sentences. So what to do with that was so absurdly difficult a problem that it became an interesting project. Then insofar as this series continued, it really devolved. I had to bail and let Callahan screw artists and writers on his own. On the other hand, there were some others that went through. I looked over the second one, and then after that, it just disappeared from my mirror and from everybody else's. The publisher had gone. Nobody else wanted to make books. And
so did the book actually go out of print for a number of years? Was that it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how we ended up getting the rights and redoing it.
I see. I see. Okay.
It was very hard to find, but it was also within comic circles highly regarded.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I got a copy finally because I visited a friend in Florida who was a comics publisher and also distributed some comics. And he had this box of old distro stuff. It was just like collecting dust. And I went through it and there were like 3 pristine copies of City of Cross. And it was like one of those good used bookstore experiences.
Yeah, so Avon just dropped it. They didn't care. Probably new people were in charge after a couple of years.
No, they were only impressed that a back order sold that one.
Yes,
right.
Yes. And then then you got it back and went to Picador, where I was now publishing my fiction and paperback, and you worked with Frances Cody, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, she just announced it to me. She said, "Well, we're going to redo the illustrated version." I said, "Great," but I didn't know any of the things. Because we haven't seen each other in 20 years either.
You look good.
In fact, when I saw you today, I thought he looks younger now than he did then. So something mysterious has been happening.
It's a painting that I have in there.
One of the things that came up earlier was the sort of search to find an artist to work on this book. And David, if we can show the next slide, you produced some sketches or some drafts before Paul's involvement in the project.
This began for me at a cafe table in Angoulême, sitting with Art, and Art explaining much of what he just explained here about the project and what it was, and asking me if I would like to be involved. And explaining it was going to be a series of adapting crime novels. And I said, well, I don't really read crime novels. And then he said, well, the book that we're proposing to start with doesn't really fall under that category. And so when I read the book, I was eager to give it a try, much for the same reason that Art thought it would be worth doing, because it seemed almost impossible. And, at the same time, I was busy with a lot of other stuff that I was finishing up. But eventually, you know, Art was asking, like, how's it going? And so I had to come up with something that looked like I was thinking about it. And these are some of the pages that I came up with. And I think what happened was, my initial dive into the book, I was looking for a way to tell the story. And what became evident once Paul Kay came on board was that that was the wrong way to go about it. That it was really more about finding a way to get into the structure of it. So, because I was the first person that Art asked, he was stuck with me, so I had to stay on the project. But fortunately, you were talking to Paul, and Paul had given this some thought several years ago. You know, I want to say that for this panel, I think it's really appropriate that there's a doubling of Pauls. But for the purpose of clarity, I think I'm going to refer to Paul Auster as Paul A, and Paul Karasik as Sluggo.
Sluggo. Draw you, Barman.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a really seamless, kind of mysterious collaboration. And you know, here we can see sort of your initial draft of a page, and then what came out of it after that collaboration.
Right. Well, I think it's probably good to hand it over to Sluggo now to talk about how you got involved.
Yeah. Like a Paul Auster novel, on some level, it's very strange how this all came about. For me, I was living in Brooklyn, and I was teaching at a prep school in Brooklyn Heights, and this was like 1979, 1980 or something, and Paul Auster's son, Daniel, was in one of my classes.
He was born in '77.
So maybe it was later,
He was
83.
probably
Yeah, that's right, it was late 80s. He was about 10 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks very much for clarity. And he was a really interesting kid, drew very funny comics, just enjoyed him a lot, and I knew his father was coming in for a parent-teacher conference. And this was when all 3 of the volumes of the New York trilogy were out, and I thought, wow, you know, this Brooklyn author is coming to speak about his son. I better read his books so that I can, you know, brown nose him. Maybe he'll sign my copy or something. I admired the books greatly. I thought, wow, this is really cool. There's, you know, finally somebody, a parent who's coming in who's not a Wall Street banker, I might be actually able to talk to. So I read the books, and I was really struck at the time by the New York trilogy, and I had my sketchbook there, and I made some little sketches just kind of randomly, thinking about how this might turn into a really cool graphic novel or a comic. I didn't, you know, I just was making some sketches in my blue notebook, and discarded. Never thought of it again. Actually, when Paul came to the parent-teacher conference, we never talked about it. We talked about Daniel because we were both so charmed and amused by Paul's son. And so then, I don't know, 15 years goes by or something, time goes by, and I moved out of Brooklyn, and I get a call from Art, and
in the intervening years, Paul had taken a sabbatical from being a teacher and actually became a student at SBA to take the comics classes that I was teaching there, and we got along very well. And then Paul helped on Raw for a while, and somewhere well after that, whatever next sentence comes now.
Yeah, so I'm living in the country, and I get a call from Art, and he says, you know, we're just shooting the shit as we do from time to time, and he says, you know, we're starting this series of adaptations of contemporary noir novels into graphic novels, but we're kind of struggling with this first one that we're trying to do, and you know, David Mazzucchelli's on board, and I don't know, maybe it's not going to work. It's kind of an impossible novel to adapt, and I'm getting more and more interested. And I said, well, what's the name of the novel? He said, well, I don't know, might have not heard of this Paul Auster City of Glass, and I said, well, I've already started it.
When I work with students talking about this book, one of the things that it's a great sort of conversation starter about is structure. And there's, you know, a number of superficial differences between these two versions, but the real key difference is the structure. And which is not to say that that would necessarily be immediately apparent just comparing those two pages, but within the context of the book, that structure that underlies the right-hand page from the finished edition is really part of this entire fractal-like structure that undergirds the whole enterprise. You've talked a little bit, if we could show the next slide, in the past about how Harvey Kurtzman's work has been influential to you and influenced, in part, your approach to this book. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, you know, this City of Glass is a collaboration on so many different levels. I feel that I learned a lot from looking at the work of Harvey Kurtzman and his pacing in particular. But you know, this is, like I said, it's a little bit like a Paul Auster novel. This book wouldn't have happened if Paul hadn't, if this strange coincidence hadn't occurred, you know, years before I hadn't met Paul, I hadn't read the book, I hadn't taken arts class. I mean, I was familiar with Kurtzman, but, you know, Art Spiegelman is many things, a fantastic cartoonist and illustrator, etc. But for me, Art was pivotal as a teacher, and he's a great teacher. And I learned a lot taking his classes on the history of comics, and especially a hard look at Harvey Kurtzman, a cartoonist whose work I had enjoyed before. And Harvey, so on this structure here, this on the page on the right, the three-tier triptych with hidden grid that can be broken into 3 or 4 permutations, and the type of the quantity of material that can be delivered on a certain page of comics. Is I feel that Kurtzman is hitting the right balance here. Then the 3-panel grid. I don't know if you have more slides about this, Bill, but
I have from City of Glass.
From City of Glass, yeah, sure. Let's keep
Throw a number at me.
I have a few.
Yeah, because it's a really it's
Number?
a really useful.
Oh, next one?
So you just
Got it.
Yeah, when I so
Yeah, this is one I knew we were home free.
so this 3-panel grid, this, you know, loosely one of the major plot elements of City of Glass is that the main character loses his sense of identity in the process of which he loses his grip on reality. And so this 9-panel grid that you see at the beginning of the book is you're kind of beaten over the head with it page after page, and then as the story goes on,
next slide.
Yes.
the 9-panel grid itself, yeah,
And you could just maybe keep going through that.
Okay.
A couple.
yeah.
Shout numbers.
It's actually the 9-panel grid is hidden several places in the book. Not only the grid itself, but like this tic-tac-toe board there in the middle of the page. It's in this, and actually, yeah, the window behind the guy. So it's not just the grid that what's within the context of the story itself, so that it becomes a visual metaphor for the character's sanity, and then over time,
You go to the next slide.
as he loses, I can't tell what slides he's going to show next.
And then it's amazing too how it's sort of this icon that's embedded in a lot of the panels, and then there are a few examples like this where the whole page itself becomes an icon also. So it's really operating on a microscopic scale of the panel, the macroscopic scale of the page, but then in the book, if we go to the next slide, I think you were about to say.
Yeah, and eventually the panels, as his sanity drifts from his mind, the panels themselves start to break apart, the grid breaks apart, and his grip on reality breaks apart, and the panels themselves kind of start dripping off the page.
Could I interject something about the grid? Because one of the reasons that this collaboration worked so well is yet another accident that became fortuitous, which is Paul, although a very good student, totally screwed up when he first did this. He did it on a four-row grid rather than the three-row grid, thinking that it was a bigger format than it was. And the intelligence and the thinking was all present there, but it was all wrong. It couldn't be done. Not because it couldn't be done, period, which is built into the project, but because it would be unreadable. And that meant that David, who is also a very intelligent cartoon thinker, had to rethink the 4-panel grid to start thinking about what it would be on a 3-panel grid with you. And that allowed you to enter into something other than an illustrator of somebody else's text. And that really made the book lift off from where it was already. Now we're getting there, we're there, now we're there.
You must have alerted Paul to the 4-tier thing earlier, because by the time I got...
You got a 3-tier.
It was a 3x3.
Man, but it really made a big difference to change it down and around that way.
Oh, yeah.
Tightened it up into a stratospherically successful
I mean, what happened was that Paul, because he had such a handle on getting into the structure of the book, excuse me, slug up, you worked up an entire draft with sketches for the whole book with this 9-panel grid.
And this is from
there,
Paul.
Basically, there we are. Which was our starting point, really. And I think, if I remember correctly, the first scene that you worked on was that strange monologue of Peter Stillman the Younger.
Yeah. Yeah, because this, the chapter 2 of the book is devoted to like a 20-page monologue or soliloquy by this poor young character who has been locked in a closet by his father, and that was a real challenge because how do you turn that into a monologue into something that is going to be visually interesting for the reader and keep all of Paul's words, condense it, and give it some sort of visual richness. And once that problem got solved, everything else was smooth sailing. That was the.
If you can show slide 30, actually, we can see what Paul is just talking about. This is like what's really interesting about this is that because the grid is such a constant presence, it allows you to have these kind of non-diegetic sort of panel transitions in a way where the images don't even necessarily have a very obvious reference to one another, and yet because you're sort of locked in this rhythm through the book, you accept it, and the text pushes you forward as well.
So this sequence here, it starts out, it's, I don't know, 12 pages long, down from 20 of Paul's, something like that. And you can see in this spread, it's about halfway through it. And if you see at the upper left-hand corner there, there's those 3 tiers go together, and then the middle set of tiers go together, and then I'm sorry, the top 2, and then they're couplets.
The previous page it was 3.
The previous page it was 3, and then this is the 2 panels of the whale, the 2 panels of the bird, 2 panels of the comic strip, the 2 panels of the dog shit, and then you get to this page, and it's 1 panel per bit of dialogue. So that we're increasing the velocity of this character's frantic speech page by page until finally we end up down at the bottom of the well with him. So you were let inside of this poor tortured man's psyche, and we had to find a visual way of doing that, of actually getting inside of him.
And quite successfully. If we could see slide 35 again, I think to go back to the sort of legal paper draft,
that 9-panel grid and all those little sketches I was doing got so claustrophobic that the book was missing an important aspect that Paul Auster had in there, which was New York City as a character. And David brought some air back into this. After years of drawing Daredevil, he knew how to draw an urban landscape. And Jesus, you really can draw an urban landscape like nobody's business. And so suddenly, when the huge transformation between my sketch and David's is like the city is a character and the atmosphere, the air.
Well, I remember when we got your version, it was, I think every page had the 9-panel grid except for 1 or 2 full pages. And the structure was terrific, but in parts it became less easily readable because, yeah, it's a little claustrophobic, and there were places where obviously you had gotten the rhythm of it just right, and other places where it seemed like even you were struggling a bit for like, well, I've got to work within these panels, but how am I going to find the right images? And that was where, after talking about it, opening it up like this allowed it to be more readable. And since I had done a few years of commercial hack work, I was a little familiar with how to make things a little more accessible to the public. So
God bless you, David.
But you were also contributing visual ideas. Also.
Yeah.
And if we could just go to the next slide, just since we're looking at various phases in the process, this is how it looks in the finished book, and on top of restructuring the book, contributing the sense of atmosphere, contributing visual ideas, of course there's just this beautiful ink and brush drawings here too that gives it a really appealing surface.
One teeny little revelation here. This issue of the New Yorker, I was doing the adaptation of the book, and this issue of the New Yorker was in my bathroom. It's an actual cover of an issue of the New Yorker. And it's got a Humpty Dumpty falling, which is an obsession of one of the characters in the book. Is this character Humpty Dumpty? And this sounds so much like you wrote this, Paul. Because on top of that, inside is a story about Caspar Hauser, the wild child.
Which was referred to in the novel.
Yeah. So, boy, this one.
You see how strange the world is.
So I had to put that in there. Yeah, it had to be in there.
If
There's shit like that all through this.
Yeah. one of the features of the book too is that not only does the structure sort of manipulated through dynamics throughout, but the style shifts a lot too. If we could look at slide like 45, for example, even within the book, there's a number of different visual styles, David, that you use. Some are more iconographic, some are specific references, like to a woodcut kind of visual style. But there's a kind of core visual style that's sort of the, I guess, the neutral style of the book. How were you thinking about what that neutral, in quotation marks, style needed to be in order to accommodate the various shiftings that this book required?
Well, the first thing was the book was this big. So I knew that I had to draw it in a style that would read at a small scale, which is why I went for something as relatively simple as it was. And there were certain things that were in Paul, your version. I mean, yours was really rough. It didn't really deal with the style so much, but you had already sort of established that Quinn was going to be sort of a relatively blank, egg-like character. So the egg sort of shaped head, and trying to keep, once you do something that cartoony, you can't let the rest of the drawing go too realistic, or it's a little too jarring. So it had to exist in this halfway between cartoon and naturalism. And then, since there were so many parts of the book that diverged from the main line of action, that, I think, was the first place I got really interested in adapting the way I was drawing to demarcate, now we're inside this character's head thinking about this, or now we're in the past, or now we're talking about, this particular moment. And so that was a way for me to allow that layer. In addition to all the things we're talking about, the language and the structure and the drawing, let the style of the drawing also be another indicator of where we're moving, and not let it ever get so far away that it felt like we're in another book, but that it was still connected.
You'd referred to some of the work that you had done as a younger artist as hack work. It's still work that's greatly admired by a lot of people today. If we can go to the next slide. It's okay. No, but the only point...
At least you put up a picture of two people kissing.
I did that on purpose. It's neat.
I did a lot of people punching each other. And much
I
easier.
wouldn't even know Batman is necessarily in this comic in this panel. This is like Casablanca or something. No, but I mean, the point that I wanted to make is that, you know, Art, I think, had identified that you had a sort of ability to draw these kind of urban sort of...
This was the only superhero comic you looked at in like decades or something, right?
I looked at some of the Daredevils also. You know, there's a time when one could keep up. There's a time when one could keep up with everything because nothing was happening.
Right.
So,
that's right. That's true.
So at that point, you really, you know, rose to attention quickly as something to look at because whatever it was, it didn't look like the Wayne Boring version, which I like also.
Oh, I like Wayne Boring.
But happily, it did not look like whoever it was that was doing Daredevil before that. Was that Gene Colan or something like that, which was really just illustrating and not thinking about what became really obvious in City of Glass, which is the anatomy of comics rather than the anatomy of muscles.
And if we can put up the next one, around the time that you were doing City of Glass, you were also self-publishing a comics anthology called Rubber Blanket, and this was a very experimental period for you. And you were working in a lot of different mediums, a lot of different visual styles. The visual style is moving a lot more towards a kind of cartoony abstraction, I guess.
Want of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, did working on City of Glass, was that an extension of your interests at the time, or did it fold back into the stuff that you did afterwards?
I don't know. It was a good project. It was to keep the metaphor of this is, you know, like an Auster novel. It was a good project for me at that time because my thinking was already going in that direction. I was publishing my own comics and trying to push my own writing, my own way of dealing with storytelling and graphics and all the visual aspects of how comics works. And then to have this project, which really stretched the way I think both of us thought about what comics can do and how to take complex, non-visual information and find these visual analogs for it it happened to be a really good project for me at the time, as far as what I was then going to continue doing.
If we could go to slide 50.
Tries to say something true in the sense of something that happened rather than something emotionally true. I just find like it took place in a hotel in Chicago. No, a motel in Indiana. No, my apartment. And the possible shifting ground rules. I keep trying to find what the motor was for making the fiction, which gets me back to something I directly experienced, and then I lose track of the fictional structures. So I find myself constantly reading books on how to write fiction. But when you know, one of the times that Paul and I had a semi-serious conversation, I was whining about exactly this issue, and the thing that was amusing to me was I was trying yet again to figure out the solution of how to write a fiction story based on a manual on how to write fiction, actually a weird object on how to write fiction called the plot genie from the 1920s, where you would spin for your characters and the location and the complication. And I was working from that and working out a story. But what was really fantastic is I'm whining to Paul. Paul then says, "But Art, just think of it, weren't you ever a kid?" I said, "I think so, I can't remember." But then says, "But you take these like little teddy bears and stuffed dolls and toy soldiers and go, oh yeah, you know, like, and it's just like, it's a puppet show, man, just like let it happen." But the only thing that stuck with me was the character I'd spun for the female lead, was a ventriloquist's daughter. At which point I did a sequence about Paul telling me to think of it as a puppet show. This is still a half-one script that I will return to.
Have you ever used the plot genie?
I
never knew about it until Art told me. It sounds like the Dada Manifesto #7 by Tristan Tzara, who said, "Do you want to write a poem? Take a newspaper, cut up all the words, throw them into a hat, and pull them out one by one, and just write down in order the words. And there you are, a poet and a genius."
Okay, I'm gonna buy a hard copy of the paper. I can't cut my iPad up easily.
And if we could jump to slide 57, the one other image I wanted to make sure that we looked at that kind of spins off this whole discussion of City of Glass and collaboration and everything. Art, you had designed a new cover for a relatively recent deluxe edition of the New York.
Well, it's a Penguin classic, you see. And all these years go by, and the book that was rejected, no one wanted, and now it's a Penguin classic. In a beautiful illustrated series, one of several done by comic artists. And so it was only appropriate that Art should do this. I know he knocked his head against the wall. He spent much more time on it than he should have. Because he not only did the cover, but he did the flaps, he did the back, and then he did frontispieces for each of the three within the book.
Yeah,
so it was quite a lot of work.
Do you have the frontispiece?
Yes. Yeah, it's up there.
That's what was really neat.
Oh,
yes.
So it was another one of very happy collaborations with
That
Art.
worked out really well, but the thing that took me the most time was learning how to make a distressed pulp-looking cover on Photoshop. That was really, a month was lost there.
Well, what I wanted to ask you, Art, is it seems to me, well, I mean, you were very involved with one intense collaborative process of visualizing this book once. Was there any anxiety about like repeating those earlier solutions?
Oh no, I was grateful that I had a place to start thinking from. You know, so here it was just part of that little parade of City of Glass covers that you showed. When you didn't show some of the more modern, very graphic designy solutions to new editions of your work. But there's a nice one with these yellow and black.
Yes. Penguin
slab.
covers.
Yeah, so there's different ways of attaching it. I found that the pulp roots that are somewhere embedded in this postmodern novel that looks to Derrida were worth bringing back to the fore.
Soi-disant.
And
This is a sketch for the complete version.
I knew it had to have a map back, because when you were showing the mouse thing before, like, that was the thing that really attracted me to the old Dell paperbacks. And it's definitely a concern of Paul's. Clearly, place is an important part of every one of the books I've read of Paul's, and the map, the aspect of the map was important. And like the back cover of Mao's, I felt that like something that could be a map with an inset Tower of Babel would be, that was an early part of finding a solution to what I was doing.
We only have a few minutes left. If anyone in the audience would like to ask a question of our panelists, I would at least like to provide that opportunity for a couple of people. Is there anyone who's willing to break? Yes.
I'd like to ask Mr. Mazzucchelli if the name Asterios Polyp in his great graphic novel is a nod to Paul Auster.
The question was if the title Asterios Polyp, the title of David Mazzucchelli's most recent graphic novel, is in any way a nod to Paul Auster.
I'm afraid it's not, but if you'd like to think that.
But I have to tell you, David knows this, but in one of my later novels, The Brooklyn Follies, I have a character named Nancy Mazzucchelli, and there was an homage to David.
Why?
Yes.
This is a question for Mr. Spiegelman. You mentioned that you've been collaborating more and more, and that you started off somewhat allergic to the idea of collaboration. Has your experience of collaboration changed with time, and so how?
And the question was if Art's experience or maybe the appeal of collaboration has increased over time.
Yeah, because I learned the areas I can collaborate in. As a control freak, I find it very difficult to share the parts of the project that I need to think through, which usually have to do with the breakdowns, the concept, how to do it, where I was at some point working for Playboy for a living, and found it's much better paid to write a comic than to draw it with the agony I go through drawing. So I did a lot of things for other people to illustrate, but I found I could never find somebody to make the mistakes the way I make them. And so those things were very unsatisfying. I find that now I'm in the middle of a collaboration that will be coming to the Brooklyn Academy of Music in January, which is some kind of weird thing. It's a cross between an academic lecture on roots of the graphic novel that aren't usually considered part of the graphic novel, the woodcut novels of the 20s and 30s, turned into a concert with a friend that I met through Paul. A musician.
I can't believe I did that.
A musician named Philip Johnston. And I found that if I was planning this thing to talk about the woodcut novels, I needed to show some of the material, which meant turning these single-page things inspired in part by silent films, but having a very different effect back into silent films to show sequences of them, which meant having somebody help me with QuickTime, which was one form of collaboration I needed to be able to do, and then ultimately have that informed by somebody who, among his many other skills as a musician, loves doing and does amazing silent film scores. So we have 6-piece live band doing this at BAM on the 18th, and that's a collaboration that works because even when I would keep time to what Philip was doing, he would ask me to stop because it was confusing him, I was doing it wrong. And it's fine when there's like a clear demarcation of roles for me.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, for any of you, I feel like there's a perception this is a very unique book, just how it came into being, the sort of adaptation it is. Do you feel like there's any comics before or after that share a similar, that are in the same genre in terms of form, adaptation, any of that?
Okay, so the question was whether that this is a rather unique book, but are there other books that have come along that any of the panelists might see as being in any way analogous or in the family of City of Glass?
No. Okay. No, but I would say that two things. One is, I think some things that happened in breakdowns made this kind of work possible. You know, because it was a rethinking of how do you unmoor words and pictures from each other and make them come together in a different way. But the more important thing is Francoise, another collaborator of mine that I've had for a very long time, I'm happy to say, when we did Raw magazine, we actually did a whole issue devoted to collaboration. And at the time, because historically that was the time, I was trying to find out if two heads like two Germanys could be better than one. And at that point, we did discover that people were really natural and great collaborators because they were great friends, like Munoz and Sampaio. Their work together always impressed me somehow even more than the two talented people when working separately or with others. And then trying out crazy collaborations, like inviting Alan Moore to work with Mark Beyer. And that worked very well as well.
Anyone else want to chime in on the question of whether or not there are any other books in the family of this one, if anyone liked this book?
Well, there's maybe on the other flip part of that question, any good comics adaptations? There's a handful.
I would say Bob Sikorian's work is in that very small category.
Yep. There was a nice book of Thoreau by John Porcellino that captured the essence of Walden, I think. A few of them. Most of them not. You know, one of the problems with most adaptations is that they're not respectful of the original source. And the assignment that I got here was that we were doing an adaptation of Paul's work. And as Paul said, you don't add any words, and you captured the essence of what this book is about. So actually, one of the first thing that I did when I got the job was we knew that the adaptation was 100 and
whatever it was,
whatever,
over it.
Yeah, whatever it was.
120.
120 pages, and Paul's book was 219 pages. And so I created a ratio of how many pages of the original we had to tell the adaptation. And I think it was like a page, each page had to contain 1.8 pages of information. And so then it made a little graph, and so that all the highs and lows of Paul's story are replicated in ratio to the original one. So when you read the two books, it's like you're getting the same story. And so I don't, you know, So that's a secret of adaptation if anyone's thinking of doing it.
It's all mathematics.
That's all it's math.
But you had a great advantage because one picture is worth 1,000 words.
Ah, that's true. There you go. There you go.
Was influenced by modernism as well. I wonder if you could specify, that's as broad a category as postmodernism. What is your particular interest in modernism for you, Art, or for any of you?
Okay, so the question was about Art's particular interest in modernism as well as the modernist themes in David's book, what any of the panelists might take from modernism as an influence.
I'm afraid to start because it's a 4-hour answer, I think. For me at the time, it had to do with understanding that modernism was invented by cartoonists. But quite literally. The cabarets of Montmartre, those little cafes, it was invented as an amusement for people who were getting stoned on absinthe and were inventing black-on-black painting well before it became a thing, putting mustaches on the Mona Lisa 30 years before Duchamp got there, doing various investigations of what they of what images could do, what words could do, that weren't thoroughly admired in naturalistic representation, but they did it while yucking it up and laughing, which brought it back to being the comics when I found my way into modernism that had a kind of sobriety. Yes, of course Duchamp is funny, but the real joke is that somebody really wants to buy that painting. So bringing it back to those roots was really important for me to enter into trying to discover what they were investigating when they were looking at a Cézanne. And for me personally, that had to do with if one is investigating one's own medium and its materials, how do these words and pictures fit together? Why? What happens when you put a bunch of boxes together on a page? You can't ignore the implications. To go back to the last answer about why are there so many bad adaptations, it's because illustration does not make a good adaptation. It has to be involved in that phrase that I just blurted out earlier about an anatomy of comics. How is something actually built, which is the way most novelists build what they do. They have some kind of structure that they're working through and in, and that aspect of structure became very overt in modernism, and was useful for me to find another re-entry into what comics could be, so that the aspect of it being a structured event was echoed for me when there was an article on Picasso in an old Life magazine, and somebody wrote an angry letter saying, what did Picasso do? He just never finished his fucking paintings. He didn't use the word fucking in the letter.
You can tell it.
But then it's just saying that all of this stuff is the same stuff that always existed, except earlier artists had the dignity to finish and put a surface on top of their structure. Can you add anything to this? Best I can do.
I don't know. The character in my book is more interested in modernism than maybe I am particularly, but I do have an interest in that, and it's not too dissimilar from what Art was saying, but if I could distill down what it is to me, what my interest is, it's that modernism, it's a way of thinking about the way something exists it is what it is, as opposed to it being an illusion of something else, and recognizing that aspect of whether it's a painting or whether it's a writing, or that the awareness of these are sentences, these are words, and knowing that and being able to play with that. But I don't, I mean, you can call it modernism, but to me it's just the job of any artist, is to understand the art form you're working in and then do whatever you can to exploit the strengths of that art form. Whether that's, you know, a modernist view or just making art, that's what it is for me.
Okay, on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists.